Welcome home to Passionate Justice 164 for the week of 11 February 2017. I am Jonathan Wolfman. Thank you so very much for being with us this week on our Salon Radio. At our Salon Radio, we invite you to read with us, write with us, and of course, you're not required to write if you are comfier reading, commenting, but I do think you will want to write. You may join the Our Salon Readers, Writers community. How many? Well over 1,100 superb writers, keen readers, personal essay, memoir, poetry, political, social justice, commentary, where www.oursalon.ning.com. Join us. Yes, join us. Membership, as with all the very best of life, is free. And now, Passionate Justice may also be heard Monday night, 7 p.m. Pacific on APRI, Alternative Public Radio International. And do dig this, you may hear all of our salon's programs, every one of the podcasts. Listen at your leisure. How? www.oursalon.ning.com/new episodes. One word, new episodes. And I ask you, watch on Netflix the award-winning film OC-87. It is a brilliant personal journey and triumph, living with mental illness, overcoming, directed by Bud Clayman, a friend of our program. Were you to write a review of it, I would air it. God bless our newborn Reich. And I have an opening message to progressives. You know, I become concerned when progressives analyze fascists' moves to a point of harm, where what matters are their takes on each separate, deliberately steamrolled insult to democracy, so that by the time they fashion pithily refined version umpteen, wasting thought, energy, not subverting illegitimacy itself, in too many instances expecting applause for it all, they look up, surprised that detention wire and prison bars do not clap. Last week we began Harper's Magazine's 11-part Resistor's Guide. Today, parts 3 and 4. Part 3, American Nightmare by Wesley Young. The term meritocracy became shorthand for a desirable societal ideal soon after it was coined by the British socialist Sir Michael Young, but Young had originally used it to describe a dystopian future. His 1958 satirical novel, The Rise of the Meritocracy, imagines the creation and growth of a national system of intelligence testing, which identifies talented young people from every stratum of society in order to install them in special schools where they are groomed to make the best use possible of their innate advantages. In the novel, what begins as a struggle against inherited privilege results in the consolidation of a new ruling class that derives its legitimacy from superior merit. The class becomes, within a few generations, a hereditary aristocracy in its own right. Sequestered within elite institutions, people of high intelligence marry among themselves, passing along their high social position and superior genes to their progeny. Terminal inequality is the result. Terminal inequality is the result. The gradual shift from inheritance to merit young rights made, quote, nonsense of all their loose talk about the equality of man. Men, after all, are notable not for their equality, but for their inequality of their endowment. Once all the geniuses are amongst the elite and all the morons are amongst the workers, what meaning can equality have? What ideal can be upheld except the principle of equal status for equal intelligence? What is the purpose of abolishing inequalities in nurture except to reveal and make more pronounced the inescapable inequalities of nature? Well, I thought about this book often in the years before the crack-up of November 2016. In early 15, the Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam published a book that seemed to tell as history the same story that Young had written as prophecy. Our Kids, the American Dream in Crisis opens, that is Putnam's book, opens with an evocation of the small town of Port Clinton, Ohio, where Putnam grew up in the 50s, a passable embodiment of the American dream, a place that offered decent opportunity for all the kids in the town, whatever their background. Port Clinton, as Putnam is quick to concede, a nearly all-white town in a pre-feminist and pre-civil rights America, and it was marked by the unequal distribution of power that spurred those movements into being. Yet it was also a place of high employment, strong unions, widespread home ownership, relative class equality, and generally intact two-parent families. Everyone knew one another by their first names, and almost everyone was headed toward that better future. Nearly three-quarters of all the classmates Putnam surveyed 50 years on had surpassed their parents in both educational attainment and in wealth. When he revisited it in 2013, the town had become a kind of American, a kind of an American nightmare. In the 70s, the industrial base entered a terminal decline, and the town's economy declined with it. Downtown shops closed, crime, delinquency, drugs skyrocketed. In 93, the factory that had offered high-wage, blue-collar employment finally shuttered for good, and by 2010, the rate of births to unwed mothers had risen to 40%. 2 years later, the average worker in the county was paid roughly 16% less in inflation-adjusted dollars than his or her grandfather back in the 70s. Young's novel ends with an editorial note of informing readers that the fictional author of the text had been killed in a riot that was part of a violent populist insurrection against the meritocracy, an insurrection that the author had been insisting would pose no lasting threat to the social order. Losing every young person of promise to the meritocracy had deprived the working class of its prospective leaders, rendering it unable to coordinate a movement to manifest its political will. Without intelligence in their heads, he wrote, the lower classes are never more menacing than a rabble. We are in the midst of a global insurrection against ruling elites. We are now. In the wake of the most destructive of the blows recently delivered, a furious debate arose over whether those who supported Donald Trump deserve empathy or scorn. The answer, of course, is that they deserve scorn for resorting to so depraved and false a solution to their predicament, and empathy for the predicament itself. And not just because advances in technology are likely to make their predicament far more widely shared. What is owed to them is not the lachrymose pity reserved for victims, although they have suffered greatly, but rather a practical appreciation of how their antagonism to the policies that determined the course of this campaign, mass immigration and free trade, was a fully political antagonism. that was disregarded for decades to our collective detriment. A policy of benign neglect of immigration laws invites into our country a casualized workforce without any leverage, one that competes with the native-born and destroys whatever leverage the latter have to negotiate better terms for themselves. The policy is a subsidy to American agribusiness, meatpacking plants, restaurants, bars, and construction companies, and to American families who would not otherwise be able to afford the outsourcing of childcare and domestic labor that the post-feminist dual-income family requires. At the same time, a policy of free trade pits native-born workers against foreign ones, content to earn pennies on the dollar of their American counterparts. In lieu of the social democratic provision of childcare and other services of domestic support, we have built a privatized ad hoc system of subsidies based on loose border enforcement. In effect, the nation cutting a deal with itself at the expense of the life chances of its native-born working class. Our nation has cut a deal with itself at the expense of the life chances of our native-born workers. In lieu of an industrial policy that would preserve intact the economic foundation of their lives, we rapidly dismantled our industrial base in pursuit of maximal aggregate economic growth with no concern for the uneven distribution of the harms and the benefits. Some were enriched hugely by these policies. The college-educated bankers, accountants, consultants, technologists, lawyers, economists, corporate execs who built a supply chain that reached to the countries where we shipped the jobs. Eventually, of course, many of these workers learned that both political parties regarded them as fungible factors of production, readily discarded in favor of a machine or a migrant willing to bunk 8 to a room. 4 decades of neoliberal globalization have cleaved our country into 2 hostile classes, and the line cuts across the race divide. On one side, college students credential themselves for meritocratic success, and on the other side, white working class increasingly comes to resemble the black underclass in indices of social disorganization. And on one side of the divide, much energy is expended on the eradication of subtler inequalities. On the other side, an equality of immiseration increasingly obtains even before the ruling elite sent the proletariat off to fight a misbegotten war, even before it wrecked the world economy through heedless lending, even before its politicians rescued those responsible for the crisis while allowing working class victims of all colors to sink. The working class knew that it had been sacrificed to the interests of those sitting atop the meritocratic ladder. The hostility was never just about differing patterns in taste and in consumption. It was also about one class prospering off the suffering of another. We learned this year that political interests that go neglected for decades invariably summon up demagogues who exploit them for their own gain. The demagogues will go on to betray their supporters and do enormous harm to others. If we are to arrest the global descent into barbarism, we will have to understand the political antagonism at the heart of the meritocratic project and seek a new kind of politics. If we choose to neglect the valid interests of the working class, Mr. Trump will prove in retrospect to have been a pale harbinger of even darker nightmares to come. Do you wonder how a newborn Reich arises in America? What you heard was one way. Now, part 4 of Harper's Magazine's Trump, a Resister's Guide. This is called Terms of Engagement. Is there a German word for an argument everyone pretends to abandon but keeps having? The American left's debate about race, class, and gender, it is old. Generations of radicals have asked whether one structure of domination holds the key to all the others. Almost as old as the recognition that the question is badly posed. Surely, choosing a single priority is not just difficult, but it is inadequate. Surely it would be better to see the terms as dialectically intertwined, alternative approximations from which to approach the imposing tangle of social relations. Yet the argument, which pits in its current parlance identity politics against class analysis, that argument just doesn't stop. It's only gotten louder with the twin shocks of 2016. Bernie Sanders' surprising success in the Democratic primary, Hillary Clinton's surprising defeat in the general election. Squint, and you see one obvious truth. The only way for the left to win is a broad social democratic appeal to the entire working class, white people included. Blink, and something else is just as clear. The prerogatives of white men have been violently reasserted against the legacy of Barack Obama and the prospect of Clinton. Even if some of those racists are among capitalism's victims, we should not give them an inch. There is nothing more essential for our political future than overcoming this divide, but many sorts of inertia, deep political commitments, contingent social alliances, contingent people, but those who are wrapped in them think are necessary, but indeed they are contingent only. They are contingent social alliances, personal branding, to say nothing of the buzzing, blooming reality that will continue to provide evidence for many contradictory conclusions, will impede convergence. Everyone who feels they have a stake in the dispute about the relative importance of race, class, and gender need to advance from their own chosen starting point toward other people who share the same fundamental commitment: liberation from oppression and domination, and perhaps more significant, the same enemies. I want to propose two terms: racial capitalism and social reproduction, that might be helpful. South Africa under apartheid may be the starkest example of what activists called racial capitalism. There, it was perhaps obvious that the basic rules governing economic relationships, who could own things, what it meant to own something, what a boss could get away with, could not be defined apart from categories of racial subordination. It took an ensemble of popular organizations, communists, African nationalists, trade unions, more than 40 years to overthrow the regime. But in the U.S., as well, racial categories have their roots in numerous regimes of unfree labor, from the African slave trade to the guest worker program. A worker with nothing to sell but her labor power is different from a worker with nothing to sell but her labor power and the family house. Given current trends, it would take the average black family 228 years to match the level of wealth currently held by the average white family. It should not be difficult to see that race is, for non-white people in the U.S., a fundamental way of experiencing material class inequality. In Italy in the 1970s, at the high point of the class struggles between union and capitalists, well as between workers and their unions, socialist feminists found themselves making use of the concept of social reproduction How does a society cultivate the conditions of its future existence? Before wage workers could produce things in factories, these theorists reasoned someone had to produce, that is, give birth to and raise and feed and clean up for the workforce. People who performed this labor were by and large women. That they were not paid a wage only confirmed that their role came prior to and was indispensable for the parts of common life that official stats recognized as economic. The Italian theorists who proposed the term considered it vital not because they wanted to assert the importance of gender identity over other identities, but because without the insight it provided, no understanding of the class struggle and no organization of the working class would be complete. Besides these existing concepts, which offer the terms for a more fruitful future discussion, we must reorganize that set of ideas and recognize that the struggles currently glossed as class and identity are both capable of sketching broad, universalizing horizons or narrow, particularizing ones. The causes can bring people together or divide them to be conquered. The partisans of class politics are rightfully proud that the history of socialist, communist, and trade union organizations contains a wildly disproportionate share of the most advanced anti-racist struggles. This is an index of the power that shared interests, more than good intentions or painstaking language, can have in bringing people together for effective action. These achievements also reflect the fact that labor radicals with a vision of industrial democracy have sometimes been able to see beyond the shabby articles of faith that mainstream politicians take for granted. At the same time, it is trivially easy to trace a line of exclusion through the history of American trade unions and the institutions of the white left. This is a function of the limited ability white workers and radicals have to dissociate themselves from the racist common sense that structures society in general. Think of the American Communist Party, which greeted World War II by expelling its Japanese members and supporting their internment as enemy aliens. The tendency toward exclusion also illustrates something about the nature of economic struggles. Even though we all have material needs, there is nothing about a struggle that centers on a certain workplace, targets economic elites, or concerns issues like the wage that automatically makes the struggle universal. Nothing automatically makes that struggle universal. To the contrary, in most instances, they are parochial, narrow defenses of the conditions of life for a specific group of workers. The lines of inclusion and exclusion can be drawn along many axes, of which perceived racial identity is merely one. There is also language, religion, skilled versus unskilled labor, and most commonly, sector versus sector. When white strikes beat up black strike breakers, when those strikers beat up black strike breakers, is it about racism or economic anxiety? Just asking the question reveals how silly it is, but saying, of course it's both, doesn't point the way toward a natural solution. It simply suggests that many conflicts, no matter how they are understood, have no universalizing logic. Ultimately, the problem is not deductive, but practical. How to overcome mutual suspicion, probably well justified, between people who cannot afford to work at cross purposes. We can disagree about the exact ways that different forms of oppression overlap and about the strategic implications of this analysis, but since most of us predicted the election wrong, most of us did, most of you listening to this broadcast predicted the election wrong, as I did, this disagreement should be attended by generosity and humility. We need constructive engagement across the boundaries that currently exist. In the end, it is not a question of winning an argument, but of defeating an adversary. It could not be more important that we focus on the real enemy. You know, one of the most powerful books I've ever picked up was by a fellow named Goldhammer. He wrote a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners, and it talked about the ordinary German, so often lied about in even serious history books. Now, skeptics of Goldhammer's book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, may have been convinced that ordinary Germans, because of some flaw or perceived flaw in the German character, the Teutonic character, well, maybe they knew everything and helped and supplied the labor that they knew was going to murder millions. But oh no, not others, and certainly not Frenchmen, Brits, Americans. We could never do that. Well, I want to share with you from the Washington Post a new piece by Chris Edelson, a professor at American University here in Washington. It is called Ordinary Americans Carried Out Inhumane Acts for Trump. Again, from Chris Edelson. Federal workers were willing to commit inhumane acts for President Trump at U.S. airports. Would you? A week ago, men and women went to work at airports around the United States, as they always do. They showered, got dressed, ate breakfast, perhaps dropped off their kids at school. Then they reported to their jobs as federal government employees, where, according to news reports, one of them handcuffed a 5-year-old child, separated him from his mother, and detained him for several hours at Dulles Airport. At least one other federal employee at Dulles reportedly detained a woman who was traveling with her 2 kids, both U.S. citizens, for 20 hours and without food. A relative says the mother was handcuffed even when she went to the bathroom and threatened with deportation to Somalia. At Kennedy, still other federal employees detained and handcuffed a 65-year-old woman traveling from Qatar to visit her son, who was a U.S. citizen and serviceman stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. She was visiting U.S. servicemen. The woman was held for more than 33 hours, according to the New York Times, and denied use of a wheelchair, though she needed one. The men and women who work for the federal government completed these and other tasks and then returned to their families, where perhaps they had dinner and read stories to their children before tucking them into bed. Well, you know, when we worry and wonder about authoritarian regimes that inflict cruelty on civilians, we often imagine tyrannical despots unilaterally advancing their sinister agenda. But no would-be autocrat can act alone. No would-be autocrat can act alone. As a practical matter, he needs subordinates willing to carry out orders. Of course, neither Donald Trump nor Steve Bannon personally detained any more than 100 people held at airports over the weekend pursuant to the administration's executive order. They relied on assistance. But that's the point. The men and women who reportedly handcuffed small children and the elderly, separated the child from his mother, and held others without food for 20 hours are undoubtedly ordinary people. All right, I'll do it. What, you do it with me. Let's just call them 1940s ordinary Germans. What I mean by this is that they are, in normal circumstances, people who likely treat their neighbors and co-workers with kindness and don't intentionally seek to harm others. That is chilling, as it is a reminder that authoritarians have little trouble finding the people they need to carry out their acts of cruelty. They don't need special monsters. They don't need, and I'm saying this here, people, to empty the asylums and jails and put SA and SS uniforms on most of them. They don't need special monsters. They can issue orders to otherwise unexceptional people who will carry them out dutifully, and it ought not to be a surprise. You know of the famous Milgram experiment and subsequent studies that suggest that many people will obey instructions from an authority figure, even if it means harming another person. It is also perfectly understandable, which does not mean it is justifiable. How many of us would refuse to follow an instruction from a superior at work? It is natural to want to keep one's job, even if at the price of inflicting cruelty on another human being, even perhaps a kid. The question that you need to ask yourselves is, what will you do? This is not a hypothetical question anymore. Most of us will not face the stark choice employees at Air Force faced over that weekend. It wasn't long ago, a week and a half. But we are all democratic citizens. Ultimately, our government can only act if we allow it to act. Under our Constitution, we rule. Yeah, that's right. The people rule. Our elected officials, including the president, are accountable to us. We possess the power to reject actions we see as out of bounds. We are used to doing this in elections, but democratic tools do go further. Even once an election's over, we can exercise First Amendment rights to contact elected officials, speak, write, protest. It's far easier to do nothing, to trust that somehow America's dangerous course will be set right by someone, by God, by nature, by Gaia. No, that's a dangerous gamble. And in fact, it's an abdication of your responsibility as Americans. And if I do it, it's an abdication of my own. It's an abdication of not only my responsibility as an American, but as a human. If we do nothing, that is a choice. It means we accept a government that has demonstrated that it's capable of inflicting cruelty on the innocent and the defenseless. And you think it will end there? No, it will not. What will you do? What will all of us do? Friends, this next piece comes from our salon writer, one you know very well and you have loved. I really dig this piece, a new one, by the writer from the American Northwest, who writes under the name also known as. He calls this facade of tranquility. From the interstate highway on the route I drive each day, it's possible to see 4 of the great peaks of the Cascades: Mount Hood, Mount Adams, Mount St. Helens, and Mount Rainier. Weather determines which ones will show on any given day, as it takes great force from sweeping winds to make them all appear at the same time. Sometimes, however, as the sun begins to set, casting a strawberry glow across their facade, it can seem for a brief moment that time standing still, that I'm witness to something that was, is, and will be, something that cannot be changed by the minor things that humans do. Solace envelops me in those tiny slivers of time, and fear of tomorrow ceases. The road rises, sweeps to the left, and the mountains disappear from sight as the sky reveals bright bands of stratocumulus clouds 100 miles to the west at the coast. Feathery touches of muted colors move and bend as the wind brushes them this way and that, and as I let my mind drift, it's all I can do to stay between the painted lines on asphalt. A friend made an observation recently showing concern that the unrest I've been experiencing lately may be seasonal. Perhaps I need more light in my life, was the implied suggestion. It was kind, but it didn't cover what has me rattled. I thought of that at dusk the other night as the rounded peak of the volcano in sight suddenly had a wide arc of prismatic beauty bursting from its top. A rainbow, symbol of diversity, was shimmering and beckoning me to believe that good can prevail. Nearly 20 years ago, a young Ethiopian man was stomped with steel-toed Doc Marten boots and sent back to his maker with the unrelenting bashing of his head into a pulpy mess by miscreants wielding aluminum bats, and this occurred approximately 15 blocks from my house. The perpetrators were caught, and the leader of their white nationalist group as well. Prison sentences meted out, and one later died while incarcerated. The Southern Poverty Law Center was instrumental in bringing the criminals to trial and conviction, and their work continues. Last week, only 2 blocks from that site, ugly and hate-filled graffiti and slogans were spray-painted at random on walls, and a swastika was painted on a sidewalk. The neighborhood rumor mill cyber newsletter was abuzz. The names of certain groups self-identifying as various incarnations of skinhead collectives were listed. The person in front of whose home the spray painting occurred reported the incident to the local police and the aforementioned Southern Poverty Law Center. No person or group stepped up to claim involvement. One of those people responding to the neighborhood cyber alerts took it upon himself to attempt to explain to those of us he thought to be lesser informed that a swastika is an ancient symbol of peace, stolen and inverted to mean something different, and that we should not be alarmed. It did not mean that any ill will was inherent. He admonished those of us not to be quite as concerned as we had been. I thought that to be bizarre enough. in the context of the vandalism and assaults in the past, and tried to gently persuade him to wake up. I granted that he may not have been here when the murder occurred and linked a news story to my comment as corroboration. I mentioned that the newest notice from the cowards in the form of spray paint was only blocks from the scene of the crime, and he responded that he had been gay bashed and left for dead during those same times and had decided to find a different place to be mentally to protect himself from fear. That reply shook me. I let him know that I did not think that he deserved any such treatment, and I left it at that. I did not have the slightest idea, however, why he would make the choice to deny the implicit hatred of the symbol. It seemed to me that he had opted for the facade of tranquility. We are in peril. There isn't a time for hate. There isn't a time for looking the other way. There isn't a time for turning cheeks to be pummeled. Tuesday evening's neighborhood association meeting had approximately 125 in attendance. There are slightly over 1,800 households contained in the platted neighborhood. 2 police officers appeared for the discussion but did not speak. Nearest the park, the homes are large, most preserved to original elegance, and carry high values in an inflated marketplace. As the neighborhood fans out, values decrease. The well-heeled residents, comfortable in their polar fleece, carefully faded denim, and stylish hair, affected the usual nonchalance of that community. Hugs and handshakes were everywhere as seats were chosen around the tables. As the meeting kicked into gear, the mood intensified a bit. There were a good deal of hand-wringing people and quarrelsome statements from the gathered participants. They worried about the park, designed by the Olmsted brothers, being taken over by tent campers, and too late to make a difference. They debated the recently adapted zoning changes, increasing density. The end-run defense of becoming a National Historic District was examined and proposed as a means to stop demolition and reconstruction of the human hives becoming prevalent in other parts of the city. Then some wrinkled their noses about the dogs wandering out off the leash area to make a mess that just, well, darn it anyway, someone has to just say it. It ruins a nice Pendleton blanket spread out for a picnic and free concert. Not a word was said about the graffiti that is spreading and the emboldened and hateful messages which are contained in them, except for the gusts of wind that made the well-lit U.S. flag at the entry snap to attention. It was a tranquil evening. Our friend, also known as, is right. Tranquility, it's nice. Sometimes it ought not be a goal. Now, it ought not be a goal, not an immediate one. You know that the Women's March on Washington, it is really not quite over. There are many organizing opportunities that you can have under that banner. I want you to continue on Facebook and in Google to look up the Women's March on Washington 100 actions, 100 days, 100 actions, 100 days. You can host events. Look up also the Sister March Network, the Sister March Network. There are so many activities in which you can become involved. It has not ended. The march here in Washington, the march all over the world that greeted this fascist. It is not by any stretch of the imagination finished. You may join actions in your area. If you think none of them are in your area, let me tell you, just go to Sister March at googlegroups.com. Sister March, one word, Sister March at googlegroups.com. Now, what next can be answered in wonderfully positive ways, such as Sister March at googlegroups.com. At the same time, you and I both know that what next? Well, things can go wrong. Things can go wrong. What might things going wrong look like? Now, Jonathan Zunger, from whom we heard last week, tells us that on a recent post that he wrote about President Trump marking Holocaust Remembrance Day without a single mention of Jewish people, asked a good but hard question. Why did this regime single out some particular groups, for example, Muslims, Latinos, Black and transgender people, as their main targets and not others? He says, I tried to answer this question, and while what I wrote is necessarily incomplete, I think it is at least gives us some direction. That led to adding some notes about how things are likely to develop over the next few years for each of the respective groups. I want to give you fair warning right now. This is not going to be a pretty thing to read. Well, that's what he said, and I'm telling you, this is not going to be a pretty thing to hear. This is not going to have reassurances. If you're looking for an argument that we've been exaggerating any threat and everything is going to be all right because of the benign nature of things, or that Trumpism is really fine after all, turn off your radio now. Just turn it off. Just turn it off and go look at some, I don't know, cute cats. I like cute cats. But that's not what this is going to be. We need to begin by looking at the four groups called out and ask why they are particular targets now. First, Muslims. Ever since 9/11, ever since the U.S. has been in this simmering stew, we have been that simmering stew of Muslims are evil, they want to destroy America. This was made easier by the fact that many Americans had never met a Muslim before. It was also very politically expedient for many people to encourage. And the net result is that anti-Muslim sentiment has become profoundly vitriolic and often violent across the country, only becoming more so over time. Trump has been active, supporting this form from the beginning. So it's not surprising that they're among his first targets. And let me point out here, in the Poland of 1939 that the Germans invaded on 1 September at 5 in the morning, most non-Jewish Poles would have told you they didn't know any Jews either. Latinos come from a different angle, one more tied to nativism. They're the current version of the damned immigrants, those damned immigrants that Americans have a history of blaming for things, as were the Italians, the Irish, the Germans, etc., in our past. In particular, Trump's campaign was based on exacerbating this, going to areas where there was a steady collapse of the long-term economic outlook and telling people that it was because of deals with China and Mexicans coming in and stealing people's jobs. The rhetoric was never very consistent. Immigrants are simultaneously lazy and stealing all the jobs. You can read that in the book of Exodus about the Egyptians and the Hebrew clans. Some things don't change much, but it's extremely politically expedient to encourage as well. People who are blaming immigrants for their economic problem can vent their anger against them and will not be asking too many questions about, for example, why the factory is now fully automated, or full-time employees with benefits replaced with part-timers. They don't ask things like that when they have someone to blame. Isn't this a cute little puppy? Oh, wait, you've gone to look at Facebook? Oh, no, don't do that. Don't look at the cute little puppy. Stay with us, people. Black people are a third angle still. The history of race hate there is, of course, the history of America as a whole. There is no brief summary, but the reason it's flaring up right now is tied to the Black Lives Matter movement. That's the angle they're using. In particular, whenever black people show up asking for something, or worse, demanding something, or taking a knee, there's a very strong backlash of the form everything was fine before you started stirring up racial tension. Reading American newspapers, and not just Southern ones, from the 1960s is sickeningly familiar. The articles could have been lifted word for word. The conflict with police is particularly significant because police in much of the country have historically had their primary role being to keep the races in their place and separate. The primary reason that people see America as not considering black lives to matter is, after all, that when a black person is shot, people look for justification as to why it was justified, while when a white person is arrested, to say nothing of shot, people look for the similarities between themselves. A good example pairing is Brock Turner and Trayvon Martin. Turner was arrested after being caught in the act of raping a woman behind a dumpster. Two people saw him, chased him, and held him down until police arrived. Convicted, he was sentenced to 6 months, with the judge not wanting to harm this young man's future. That's what the judge said. News stories about him invariably describe him in their headlines as Stanford swimmer. Martin, on the other hand, was a high school kid coming home from buying candy when he was shot to death by a man who was patrolling his neighborhood. His news coverage focused a great deal on how his sweater made him look threatening, all of which is to say, the things this movement are questioning are extremely tied with people's perception of danger and the social order. They're saying, in essence, that the protection of white society from black threat is real and imagined, which has been such an implicit part of the role of police for so long, is instead something the police, and by implication white society, should be censured for, which makes the emotional stakes quite high, and is why we get strange responses like Blue Lives Matter. Were people ever saying that? They didn't. The black and trans communities are actually similar in this respect. I think the origins of violence against trans communities are another giant subject that would take a whole book to address properly. It would talk about things like social role essentialism and purity taboos and masculine homosexuality taboos, but we can summarize that as saying that the rates of murder and sexual assault of and suicide by trans communities are through the roof and have been for quite some time. But the reason that trans issues are suddenly more salient, I believe, is that they've been getting more attention. The increased visibility of trans folk in the media, for example, and the fact that more people are simply likely to know someone who is transgender, puts them in roughly the same position that LGBT people were in the mid-90s. And like with the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a certain response, or why are these people asking for something from me? Ultimately, that's part of a broader pattern. When people are already stretched to their absolute limit emotionally, with financial stresses, family stresses, medical stresses, lack of a future stresses, then hearing anyone else demand anything, even if that thing is as simple as the right to walk down the street without being murdered, well, that feels like an imposition, doesn't it? And that can lead to a backlash, not just from people who are inherently racist or the like, but from some people who aren't and just don't want yet another thing dropped onto their plate. But that's when a backlash against a basic request to be allowed to live or go to the bathroom or any other basic aspect of human life, that's when it takes on a much nastier property. So, that's my top level perspective on why these particular groups are at the top of the list right now. And there are other groups, not just these groups, which are perpetually in waiting. And I suspect that we will see Native Americans, Jews, and academics rising up the list over the next few years as well. Jews, because of fairly old school anti-Semitism, maintains its currency in a lot of far-right circles, especially ones which are currently in the White House. Watch for talk about global special interests, which is a favorite euphemism about Jews in those circles. Native Americans, for the same reasons as black and trans folk, if anything happens to raise their profile. And you know that the oil pipeline has and will continue to, because that fight, people, is not over. And academics, why? Because they're part of those elites which are a convenient target for blame and are also likely to be vocal opponents of the regime. Now, what are likely to be the next steps in each of these cases? While I hope that most people are beyond the stage of saying, oh, this is all just campaign rhetoric, I know that many people will say that still, and will probably keep saying it until the day something happens to them directly. But given that in his first 8 days in office, Trump has proven himself quite honest on the campaign trail, and you know how I'm using the word honest, people, going out and doing exactly the things he said he would, from ordering walls and detention camps built at the Mexican border to banning even legal permanent residents who are citizens of various Muslim countries, but only the Muslim ones, from entering the country. I'm hoping people are just starting to realize that no, it was not a joke. So I expect to see certain steps relating to each of these groups. I don't expect to see them happen in rapid succession. Each of these is a major move which can have significant political value if spread over time. This is roughly a roadmap for the next 2 to 3 years. For Latinos, increased laws and orders exerting pressures on employers, landlords, etc., to get rid of anyone who even might be undocumented. So long as they're Latino, a good 25% of Americans can't easily produce proof of citizenship, but they won't be hassled. The goal here is to create what Trump calls self-deportation, that is, making the situation bad enough to cause people to flee. This has the side benefit of opening up jobs for the people who remain, which was an important political benefit when Hitler enacted his civil service law in 1933, when the Jews were forced out of all sorts of jobs. People said, that's terrible, but oh, Heinrich, maybe you can finally ask for that promotion now. Unlike in that case, however, most of the jobs which this would have opened up were very low wage, so this may not have the same effect. And for Muslims, increased surveillance of and leading up to registration of Muslims and Muslim groups. The next big step would be bulk revocation of visas from people from various countries, at which point they fall under the same illegals program that is set up for Latinos. This also gives political cover for mass deportation, which, as an operational footnote, also requires mass internment for logistical reasons. For black people, an increased crackdown on protests, if that's actually possible, given that police turnout in Ferguson already looked like they were ready to retake Fallujah. Escalation is not trivial, but they can find a way. Any protest, no matter how peaceful, will be declared a riot and a reason for sharply increased police presence, not just then, but going forward. We should expect to see a lot of very visible marching of cops through the streets, arrests of anyone for insubservience, and so on. Yes, this is already happening. I expect the knob to be turned higher. For trans people, a systematic passage of laws somewhere between legalizing and mandating discrimination in all things. This is already legal in much of the country, but again, it's possible to turn up the knob to basically ensure that being trans causes you to lose your job, your home, and have your children taken away from you. For trans people, a systematic passage of laws somewhere between legalizing and mandating discrimination in all things. This is already legal in much of the country, but again, it's possible to turn up that knob. Now, people, you know and I know that several state legislatures have already said that it's all right to drive your car. You will be protected if you drive your car into the middle of any protest against Trump's policies. State legislatures in our nation have offered protection for any man or woman who decides to drive his car through a crowd, but only a crowd of people protesting any of Mr. Trump's policies. And we are letting that stand. Our writer continues, I would expect that this is the first place we'll see a resurgence of purity laws. We used to have a lot of these. For example, gay people are a danger to our children and cannot be allowed to work in schools. You remember those? I do. Here you could not only have that, but you could have restrictions on where people are allowed to live. Consider that sex offender registries already deemed constitutional, and their associated requirement that you not live within a certain radius of a school essentially ban people on those registries from living in most towns and cities altogether, and force people into trailer parks and the like on the periphery of cities and towns. Also consider that you can get on those registries for public urination, which is, by law, indecent exposure and thus a sex crime. To say that it wouldn't be hard to make walking around while trans a similar crime is an understatement. Do you see how easily one folds into the other? For the press, expect to see real attempts to silence it. We'll see how that balance works out. This is not going to be a simple fight. And for academics, I expect to see tremendous pressure brought to bear immediately. All research funds for research which either goes against some policy objective of the administration, for example, climate research, or which sounds too aligned with progressive or liberal elites, that is, anything involving gender and sexuality, will be targeted. And in fact, it already has been targeted. The first major orders cutting research funds were issued when, a week and a half back. Beyond that, people, we should expect that universities will face extreme pressure to eliminate academics or administrators who speak out or otherwise upset this regime. Milo Yiannopoulos is scheduled to speak at the University of California at Berkeley. That didn't happen. He is a neo-fascist embraced by Mr. Trump and Mr. Bannon. I expect to see a lot of people described as un-American, and this to be used as an excuse to do various things at universities and to universities, which are not simply schools, but also where people meet, discuss, organize. From a timing perspective, I expect to see the laws against Latinos to be the next major move. And immigrant nativism was such a core thrust of Trump's campaign and his promise to create jobs even from the beginning with a threat of force so clear that the incentive to force outsiders out of jobs and replace them with jobs for real Americans is going to be huge. The man has already, on the telephone, suggested to the president of Mexico that he will put American troops in Mexico to enforce this horror. The timing of anti-Muslim and anti-black laws will be more closely tied to external events. Any major protest or international incident will provide excellent casus belli for such things, and so escalations will mostly time to that. But that's not an argument against protest. For Muslims, I expect to see the ratchet already turned in the next 2 or 3 years, no matter what. A piece of news from anywhere in the world could trigger it. And for the black and trans communities alike, the only thing that would minimize acts of force would be unreserved subservience to said force, basically playing step and fetch it. And as we all know, that doesn't actually protect you from anything. It just turns sudden shows of force into routine, daily ones. For foreign-born Muslims and Latinos who are undocumented, related to someone undocumented, or who might be confused for undocumented, I'd say that the red flag is now up, and it's time to consider exit strategies within a 6-month window. U.S.-born Muslims, Latinos, who have more stability inside the country, and Jews have a somewhat longer time horizon available, but I'd start quietly thinking about options for when things change. Advice for the black and trans communities is simpler because everyone already knows it. Organize. The advantage there is in numbers and shared strength and in community. That's also good advice for all of the other groups. Even if you're thinking about your exit strategy, you have very good reason to make common cause and for everyone to work and pull together. That's the thing that has a chance of preventing all of this and of saving the most lives. And I will ask you again, if you're so sure that it was far too early for there to be a trial coup within a week and a half after this inauguration, has it not occurred to you that Mr. Trump, Mr. Bannon, and the far right are not really epitomes of patience? Look, the simplest, most damnable error good people make in the face of fascists' blunt promises is to analyze those promises a cover for not wanting to believe those promises, a wishing away, enabling those promises horrid, immediate, midterm, and long-term effects, embedding them in the culture, easing fascism's grasp, encouraging its gluttony. Do not do it. Do not lend your hand to that encouragement. You send me your stories. Be creative and courageous. Take your place on that great mandala. Next to Bud Clayman and every one of our writers, next to me, you can repair this crazy place despite everything we've discussed today. You can overturn this newborn Reich. I promise, when you act on justice's behalf. Why? Because justice still exists. There is an evil patina over it now, but justice does exist, and when you act on justice's behalf, when you perceive it, when you see it, when you hear it, when you feel it, when you know it, and when you act on it, it pays back, and it will make you and everyone you love happy. I want you to join us next week here, because here and everywhere, it's passionate justice.